Okay, hi everyone. I'm going to be analyzing the last scene of The Bicycle Thief, which is one of my favorite scenes in all of film history. At this point in the movie, Antonio is in the process, the main character, of becoming a bicycle thief, and we're desperate for him to steal a bicycle, just do anything in order to get a bicycle so he can keep his job. But what's really going on in this scene, it becomes a scene about his son growing up and becoming an adult. And I'm going to explain to you through the way it's shot, how the director goes about changing it from Antonio, the hero scene, to Bruno, his son's scene. All right, so we're going to actually watch the scene and go through it. I'm going to talk about it. So we have Antonio is the main character and Bruno, his son, who sits down. Okay, now through a series of point of view shots here, this is what we call subjective shots. We see what Antonio sees, and that's a great way to get us inside the main character's head. This is something that Hitchcock uses all the time. So we see what Antonio's seeing. It's very clearly his scene. We get a shot of Bruno on the sidewalk, but we're still in Antonio's mind. He sees a bunch of bicycles, so many bicycles, why don't you just take one? He's thinking, and we're rooting for him practically to take a bicycle at the scene, even though he becomes the villain at that point because he's chasing after somebody that took his own bicycle. Again, waiting for Antonio to decide what to do. More bicycles. There's so many bicycles that no one would miss it if he just takes one, right? And you get a series of subjective shots that are meant to mimic what Antonio is thinking. So you're doing this all without dialogue, and that's why I love this scene so much, is that it's pretty much all done visually with almost no speaking between the main characters. And that's what you're trying to do in film. The objective is to communicate narrative information through the visuals and not through dialogue, right? More bicycles. Everyone's got a bicycle but Antonio. That's the idea. And notice we haven't had a single line of dialogue so far yet in the scene. All right, Antonio's getting an idea now. He's getting more and more desperate. He decides, okay, these people are getting out of the soccer game, so they're all going to be going back to their bicycles. So he's got to find a different one if he's going to steal it. So we go back to the other one that's just leaning outside this apartment building or office building, whatever it is. And notice how the cuts are getting faster too, because Antonio's deciding, he's at the point of making that decision of what he's going to do. So by cutting faster and faster, we get a sense of frenzied decision making, right? So this is how you use editing to sort of help people understand that things are getting more desperate, right? The pace of the shots gets quicker and quicker and quicker as his emotional state gets more and more frenzied, right? So now he looks over. This is an important shot, that one shot of Bruno, because Bruno's looking to him, basically for Antonio, for the father to decide what he's going to do, and he's looking to him for advice, and he's looked up to him throughout the whole movie. But Antonio's going to make a choice that's really going to harm their relationship, so it's important to understand what Bruno's reaction is, and especially because it's going to become Bruno's scene later in the movie. That's an important moment. You've got to cut to that shot. All right, here you have the first dialogue, and it has nothing to do with taking a bicycle, right? He's just telling him to go take a streetcar so he can meet him later. All right, now this is an important moment right here in the scene, because we've been basically in Antonio, the father's head the whole time, but now we cut over to Bruno and we see him alone, and now we're in the process of it becoming Bruno's scene. And now this is interesting here. The reason why you have this in long shot is because it's kind of meant to mimic Bruno's point of view, right? If it were still Antonio's point of view, we would see the bicycle much closer, and then we would cut to a close-up of Antonio looking at it. But the whole idea now is it becomes Bruno's scene, really about watching his father steal a bicycle and do something that he shouldn't do. So that's why you get this long shot here instead of a series of close-ups anymore, right? This is all the choice that a director makes to help you interpret the movie, basically. So these are the kinds of things you have to notice when you're analyzing a film, right? No close-ups here, because really, even though Bruno's supposed to be on the streetcar at this point, this is essentially Bruno's point of view. We don't know that he's seeing it, but it's the equivalent of that. So Antonio takes the bike, And we don't have any close-ups of Antonio anymore, because really at this point it's now a scene about Bruno growing up and understanding that he's the adult in the family. Even though we haven't cut to him yet, we're going to cut to him in a second. There's a beautiful shot coming up, this tracking shot on Bruno as he realizes what happens. This is called the tracking shot because we move from left to right with the character. That's that incredible moment of realization, like, what has my father just done? And now the scene is completely Bruno's. So Bruno watches, right? A long shot. We don't get closer to Antonio at this point because he's basically now the antagonist of the movie. Now it's Bruno looking and seeing what's happened. And what's Bruno going to do? All right, watch. You see here, you have basically low-angle shots of Antonio as he's being accosted by these guys. And that's because it's basically meant to mimic Bruno's point of view. Right? And here comes Bruno. You see him looking. So now all of a sudden, instead of it being a scene about a guy stealing a bicycle, it's a scene about a little boy trying to make sense of what his life is going to be like after this. If his father's going to go to jail, right? He's now the adult in the family. And this is kind of a moment that we all go through in our adolescence, right? When we realize that our parents are fallible and that we too are going to have to be adults at one day. So this to me is really a scene about growing up. All right, here's an important moment here. Like, Bruno picks up his father's hat. And notice it's kind of a long shot as we're following him. This is where you explain the principle of shot duration. If it was a quick shot of Bruno, we would just be sort of checking in with Bruno. By holding on to him for a long time, it gives us time to go inside his head. And we start thinking, okay, what is Bruno thinking? He's thinking, how is our family going to survive? Right? By holding the shot longer, you actually go into Bruno's head. You're with Bruno and you're actually understanding what his thought process is like. And you can see we don't get close to Antonio at this point because the scene's not about him anymore. It's about Bruno. He's the kind of focal point of the scene. And there's this moment here where it should be, you would think it's like a happy ending because they decide to let him go. But in fact, it's not a happy ending because he's still got no bicycle. But it's what passes for a happy ending in this Italian neorealist movie. Here, notice you get more and more shots of Bruno because it's really about him at this point. Low angle shot here on Antonio. And now Bruno understands that he's got to take care of his father. The whole movie basically has been about Antonio taking care of Bruno and trying to take care of his family. But Bruno now has to sort of look after his father. So what does he do? It's incredibly poignant. He doesn't say anything to him, but he just takes his hand and holds his hand. You'll see it here in a second. Again, because what are you could say, you could express this moment through dialogue and have the son say something like, "Oh, Dad, I'm so disappointed in you. How could you do such a thing?" But it's way more powerful to do it visually, right? Let the audience do the work and make sense of the scene. Here's Bruno thinking, like, what is going to be of our family now? And my poor father, he's falling apart. So what does Bruno do? He grabs his dad's hand. Here in a second. Looks up at him. Dad's totally ashamed of himself, and Bruno grabs his hand to take care of him. And this is almost the end of the movie here. And you get this famous last shot here where Antonio and Bruno disappear back into the crowd. And you realize that their story is just one of millions of stories that are going on in World War II Italy, where you basically have everyone who's starving. And we could have just followed anyone in this movie, but we took an hour and a half to follow Antonio and Bruno. It's a beautiful last shot because it's so ambiguous. You don't get any closure the way you would in a typical Hollywood movie. But instead, I think it's a lot more poignant to do it this way and leave things a little more open-ended. And that's it. Thanks.